The official inquiry records from Assumption Parish date the initial report to the afternoon of October 18th, 1844, though the silence that defined Silverbend Plantation had likely settled over the property days earlier. Constable Silas Varnes arrived at the main house expecting a routine investigation into a missing landowner, a matter of debt or flight, yet the atmosphere that greeted him immediately suggested a far graver disturbance. The air was unnaturally still, devoid of the labor noises that typically accompanied the sugar harvest, and the Grand Oak Alley leading to the river stood empty of all traffic. Varnes noted in his initial log that the front entrance stood wide open, not damaged, but simply ajar, as if the house itself had exhaled its inhabitants. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the damp earth, and felt a distinct dampness in the air. The oppressive weight of the humid afternoon pressed against his chest, a physical barrier that seemed to warn him against crossing the threshold into the darkened hallway beyond the columns. Stepping into the foyer, Varnes encountered a scene of profound abandonment that defied the logic of a working sugar plantation. A half-smoked cigar rested on a silver tray in the hall, dried out and brittle to the touch, while a newspaper from New Orleans lay open on a side table, as if the reader had merely stepped away for a moment. However, the layer of dust coating these surfaces was thick and undisturbed, suggesting that the stillness had reigned for far longer than the physical evidence implied. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a tall case clock in the parlor, a sound that seemed to amplify the emptiness rather than fill it. Varnes moved through the ground floor rooms, with his hand resting on his sidearm, his senses straining to catch any sign of movement. The dining room table was set for a meal that had never been served, the silver tarnished to a dull black, creating a tableau of interrupted life that felt less like a crime scene and more like a tomb sealed in haste. Varnes ascended the main staircase, his progress marked by the groaning of old timber under his weight, each step echoing too loudly in the cavernous space. The master bedroom, belonging to the notorious planter Elias Ruth, offered the first true signs of a struggle, though not the sort the constable had anticipated. There were no blood-stains or overturned furniture, but rather a precise and chilling arrangement of clothing laid out upon the bed. A white linen shirt, tailored trousers, and a formal frock coat were positioned with surgical precision, as if Routh had shed his skin along with his station. On the floor, polished leather boots sat side by side, facing the open window that looked out over the rear grounds. Varnes approached the window and looked down, seeing no ladder, no rope, and no footprints in the soft mud below, only the impenetrable wall of sugarcane that bordered the manicured lawn. The scene suggested a man who had vanished into the ether, leaving behind the trappings of his power in a ritualistic display of surrender. The inventory of the property's condition, later filed as Exhibit A in the parish archives, details the startling extent of the exodus Varnes discovered in the slave quarters. Every cabin stood empty, doors hanging from rusted hinges, with cold hearths containing nothing but grey ash scattered by the wind. There were no signs of forced removal or a midnight flight in panic. Instead, the quarters felt deliberately vacated, cleaned, and swept, as if the inhabitants had simply walked away into the night. Varnes found a single child's doll, made of rags, lying in the center of the dirt path, the only object left behind in the rows of abandoned homes. The silence here was different from the house, heavier and more expectant, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for an intruder to make a mistake. The fields of cane stood tall and unkempt, a wild tangle of green that seemed to reject the order of the rows imposed upon it, creating a labyrinth that threatened to swallow anyone who entered. A thorough search of the outbuildings revealed a disturbing anomaly near the riverbank, where the smokehouse sat isolated by a patch of bare earth. Unlike the rest of the estate, where vegetation threatened to reclaim the structures, nothing grew within a 15-foot radius of the brick building. The soil was packed hard and dry, devoid of even the stubborn plants that thrived in the Louisiana climate. Vance approached the heavy oak door, noting that it was chained shut, though the lock had not been engaged, leaving the entrance secured only by the weight of the iron links. The bricks of the structure were discolored, stained with soot that seemed to have been absorbed into the clay itself, rather than merely coating the surface. A foul odor emanated from the gaps in the masonry, a scent that was not the rot of flesh, but something older, a mixture of charred wood and a sickeningly sweet heaviness that coated the back of the throat. Removing the chains, Vance pushed the door inward and was immediately struck by a wave of cold air that defied the sweltering October heat. The interior was pitch black, requiring him to strike a lucifer match to illuminate the space. But the small flame seemed to struggle against a pressing darkness within. As his eyes adjusted, the walls of the smokehouse revealed themselves to be covered in thousands of scratches, etched deep into the brickwork from floor to ceiling. They were not random marks, but organized patterns, spirals and lines that formed a dense tapestry of resistance and memory. In the flickering light, Vance realized these were not merely tally marks, but names, hundreds of them, carved in hands that must have bled from the effort. This was a ledger of suffering, kept by those who had no other way to record their existence. A testament carved into the very bones of the plantation. At the center of the smokehouse floor, the matchlight fell upon a shape that caused Vance to recoil in instinctual horror. It was not a body, but the absence of one. A perfect silhouette burned into the brickwork, as if a man had been incinerated by a heat source of impossible intensity. The shadow was frozen in a posture of anguish, arms thrown wide, mouth open in a silent scream, detailing the final moments of Elias Ruth with terrifying clarity. Vance knelt beside the mark, his scientific mind searching for a rational explanation involving phosphorus or an industrial accident. But the evidence refused to align with logic. The surrounding brick was unscorched, and the ash within the outline was white and fine as talcum powder. This was no ordinary fire, for the conflagration had been contained entirely within the form of the victim, consuming him and leaving the structure untouched. Buried within the white ash at the center of the shadow, a glint of metal caught the constable's eye, compelling him to reach out with a trembling hand. He retrieved a heavy gold band, a wedding ring that was still unnaturally warm to the touch despite the chill of the room. Vance recognized the piece immediately from the description provided in the missing persons report. It was an heirloom belonging to the Roth family, engraved with a crest that confirmed the identity of the victim beyond any reasonable doubt. The discovery should have brought closure to the investigation, providing proof of death for the insurance companies and the courts, yet it only deepened the mystery. The ring showed no signs of melting or warping, despite the heat required to reduce a human body to ash, a physical impossibility that challenged the constable's understanding of the natural world. Leaving the smokehouse, Varnes sealed the chain around the handles with a sense of finality, feeling that he had closed a lid on a coffin that should never have been opened. He walked back toward the main house, his mind reeling from the implications of the shadow and the ring. But the silence of the plantation was suddenly shattered. From the depths of the cane fields, a sound drifted toward him on the breeze, a low, rhythmic humming that seemed to vibrate in the air. It was not the wind, nor was it the sound of any animal he recognized. It was a voice, or the memory of one, singing a melody that spoke of loss and an ancient, patient reckoning. The tone was mournful, yet triumphant, rising and falling like a breath, and it seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet, calling him away from the rational world of the law and toward the darker truths of Silverbend. Varnes followed the sound to the edge of the cane brake, pushing through the sharp leaves that sliced at his face and hands, driven by a compulsion he could not name. He emerged into a small clearing where the stalks had been flattened in a perfect circle, and there he found the source of the haunting melody. A woman stood with her back to him, her grey dress torn and stained with red mud, her hair wrapped in a cloth that had faded to the colour of dried blood. She did not turn at his approach, but the humming ceased abruptly, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against his chest. The air in the clearing was electric, charged with a static energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end, and for the first time in his career, Silas Varnes felt the certainties of his profession crumbling into dust. To speak, to assert his authority as a representative of the law. But his voice caught in his throat when she slowly turned to face him. Her features were indistinct in the gloom, shifting like smoke, but her eyes held a terrifying clarity that pierced the gathering dusk. She did not look like a fugitive or a vagrant. She looked like a judge awaiting a sentencing. The air around her seemed to warp and shimmer, creating a visual distortion that made the constable question the reliability of his own sight. Varnes fumbled for his notebook, intending to record her description for the official report, but he found his hands shaking uncontrollably, unable to form the letters that would capture the essence of the being standing before him. "You come looking for the master," she said, her voice resonating with a dual timbre that seemed to echo inside his skull. It was not a question, but a statement of fact that carried the weight of a verdict. She identified herself as Hester, a name that Varnes recognized immediately from the plantation's ledgers as one of the house servants listed among the missing. However, the woman standing before him bore little resemblance to the human property described in the estate's financial records. She spoke of Elias Ruth not as a missing person, but as a debt that had finally been paid in full. Her words were measured and archaic, stripped of the dialect he expected, conveying a sense of ancient authority that made his badge feel like a trivial toy against the forces she represented. Varnes attempted to question her about the specific events leading to Roth's disappearance, demanding a chronological account of the night in question. Hester simply pointed a finger toward the ground, her nail torn and stained with red clay, and told him that the earth had reclaimed its own. She spoke of a ledger that existed before the white man's courts, a record of suffering kept in the roots of the cane and the mud of the riverbank. The constable felt a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the setting sun, a chill that seeped up from the soil through the soles of his boots. He realized with a dawning horror that he was not conducting an interrogation. He was being instructed by a witness whose testimony extended beyond the boundaries of the living world and into the realm of ancestral memory. The narrative she wove did not begin with the night Ruth vanished, but rather 3 weeks prior, during the height of the grinding season, when the air was thick with the smell of boiling juice. Hester spoke of her daughter, a child named Hope, whose only crime had been a moment of clumsiness in the presence of the master's guests. She described the incident with a detachment that was more chilling than any display of hysteria, recounting how a dropped tray of crystal had condemned the girl to a punishment far exceeding the offense. Varnes listened, his training urging him to dismiss her story as the ramblings of a traumatized mind, yet the certainty in her voice acted as an anchor, rooting him to the spot and forcing him to bear witness to the unvarnished truth of the plantation's history. According to Hester's testimony, the death of the child was not an accident, but a calculated display of terror, meant to remind the others of the absolute power the master wielded over their lives. She described how Ruth had taken the child to the riverbank, a place that had since become a scar on the landscape, and how the sounds of the whipping had carried back to the quarters on the wind. The silence that followed had been louder than any scream, a void that swallowed the hope of every person on the estate. Varnes felt a physical nausea rising in his gut as she spoke, the graphic details stripping away the polite fiction of the peculiar institution to reveal the raw brutality beneath. He realized that the shadow in the smokehouse was not the beginning of the story, but the inevitable end of a chain of atrocities that had stretched back for generations. Hester explained that she had not sought revenge in the traditional sense, but had instead turned to the old ways, the traditions that had been carried across the ocean in the memories of the elders. She spoke of a prayer offered not to the god of the plantation owners, but to the spirits that inhabited the soil and the water. On the night of the burial, she had walked to the old ground, a forgotten corner of the estate where the ancestors lay in unmarked graves, and there she had called upon the earth to witness. She described the ritual not as a spell, but as an opening of a door, a request for justice that the natural world had been waiting centuries to grant. The constable felt the hairs on his arms stand on end as she spoke, sensing that the very air around them was listening and recording her words. The response to her prayer had been immediate and terrifying, manifesting first as a low tremor in the ground that the house slaves had felt, but the master had dismissed as the passing of a storm. Ruth had begun to deteriorate rapidly, his mind fraying at the edges as the weight of his actions returned to haunt him in physical form. Hester recounted how he had wandered the halls at night, shouting at unseen figures, tormented by the sound of a child's laughter in the empty rooms, the description aligned with accounts Varnes would later receive from neighbors who had heard rumors of the master's madness. But Hester's perspective offered a cause that went beyond simple guilt or fever. She claimed the land itself had turned against him, recognizing him no longer as an owner, but as a source of corruption that needed to be purged. On the fourth night, the climax of the haunting arrived, driving Ruth from the sanctuary of his mansion and out into the treacherous darkness. Hester described watching from the shadows as the master, clad only in his night clothes, stumbled toward the smokehouse, drawn by a compulsion he could not resist. The building had stood silent for years, a monument to the processing of meat, but on that night it became an altar of judgment. Varnes visualized the scene with horrific clarity, the once proud planter reduced to a stumbling figure of terror, fleeing from the ghosts of his own making. The smokehouse door had opened for him, not by human hands, but by a force that demanded he enter and account for the blood he had spilled. It was a pilgrimage of reckoning, ending in the chamber where so many had suffered before him. Hester fell silent, her story finished, and the clearing seemed to exhale a breath it had been holding. Varnes looked at the woman, realizing that she was no longer merely a witness to the crime, but an intrinsic part of the landscape's retribution. She warned him that the debt was not fully settled, that the earth had a long memory, and would not be placated by a single sacrifice. The plantation was no longer a place of commerce, but a consecrated site of judgment, and any who attempted to profit from it would face the same hungry justice. Her words hung in the air like a prophecy, sealing the fate of Silverbend and marking the beginning of a new chapter in the region's bloody history. Before Varnes could formulate a response, a crack of thunder shattered the silence, though the sky above remained clear and starless. Hester began to recede into the darkness of the cane, her form becoming less substantial with every step, as if she were dissolving into the mist rising from the river. The constable took a step forward, his instinct to detain her overriding his fear, but his hand passed through the air where she had stood, grasping only the damp cold of the Louisiana night. She was gone, leaving behind only the impression of her presence and the lingering scent of wet earth and decaying flowers. Varnes stood alone in the clearing, the weight of the impossible story settling onto his shoulders, realizing that his report would either make his career or destroy his sanity. He turned and began the long walk back toward the main house, his mind racing to categorize the encounter in terms that the parish court would accept. The shadow in the smokehouse was no longer a mystery to be solved, but a verdict to be recorded, a physical manifestation of a justice that transcended the statutes written in Baton Rouge. The pseudo-documentary evidence of his own eyes warred with the rational skepticism of his profession, leaving him stranded in a no-man's land between the scientific age and the ancient, superstitious world of the bayou. As he emerged from the cane, he saw that the lights of the mansion had been extinguished, leaving the empty shell of the plantation house to stand as a dark monument against the horizon, waiting for the inevitable dawn that would reveal the truth to the world. Varnes returned to the mansion on trembling legs, the encounter in the cane fields having drained him of his resolve. He found the front door he had previously examined, now locked tight, a physical impossibility given the abandoned state of the property, which suggested a force was actively denying him entry to the inner sanctum. Refusing to be deterred, he circled the perimeter to the rear of the house, where the kitchen entrance stood slightly ajar, swaying with a rhythmic creak that echoed like a heartbeat. The air here was thick with the scent of boiled herbs and old paper, a strange olfactory intruder in a house that had ostensibly been empty for days. He pushed the door open and stepped into the cavernous kitchen, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows against the cast-iron pots and pans that hung from the ceiling, like dormant pendulums. The silence was heavy, expectant, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting to see if the intruder would dare to disturb its secrets further. Seated at the massive preparation table in the center of the room was a figure who appeared to be carved from the very shadows of the corner. She was a young woman, though the strain of her existence had etched deep lines around her mouth and eyes, making her age difficult to determine. Her hands were folded neatly upon the scarred wood surface, and she stared at a fixed point on the wall with a gaze that was devoid of fear or panic. Vance approached slowly, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, though he knew instinctively that no weapon would be effective against the quiet power radiating from her. She did not startle at his approach. She merely blinked slowly, acknowledging his presence with the resignation of someone who had expected this moment for a very long time. The woman identified herself as Amara, a name that appeared nowhere in the official plantation ledgers, but which Vance would later confirm through separate testimony. She spoke with a voice that was brittle yet firm, sounding like dry leaves skittering over pavement, and she began to recount the timeline of the horror that had befallen Silverbend. She explained that she had remained behind when the others fled, not out of loyalty to the master, but out of a duty to witness the final act of judgment. Her testimony would become the cornerstone of the official report, providing the necessary human context to the supernatural events that had transpired. She described the atmosphere of the plantation in the days following the death of the child, Hope, detailing a tension so thick it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the chests of everyone in the quarters. Amara's account shifted to the incident that served as the catalyst for the reckoning, painting a picture of a household pushed to the brink of madness by a master's cruelty. She spoke of the dinner party held 3 weeks prior, a lavish affair intended to impress potential investors from New Orleans, where the pressure for perfection had been crushing. Hope, Hester's daughter, had been tasked with serving a drink, a burden too heavy for a child of merely 8 years. The accident was minor, a simple slip of a crystal decanter that resulted in a splash of red liquid on the master's pristine white cuff, but the reaction it provoked was catastrophic. Amara described the silence that fell over the table, a silence far more terrifying than any shouting, as Elias Ruth's face twisted into a mask of cold, calculated rage. The guests had looked away, complicit in their silence, as the master ordered the child to be taken to the rear garden for correction. The narrative then turned to the brutal punishment that followed, delivered with a detachment that spoke to a lifetime of endured trauma. Ruth had not used a standard whip, but a leather strap weighted with lead, designed to break the skin and the spirit simultaneously. Amara had watched from the kitchen window, unable to intervene, as the blows fell upon the small frame of the child with a rhythm that seemed to synchronize with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The beating did not stop when the child stopped crying. It only ceased when the master's arm grew tired, leaving the tiny body broken and motionless on the damp grass. The master had returned to his guests, wiping his hands on a napkin as if he had merely soiled them with dirt, while the household staff carried Hope's lifeless form away under the cover of darkness. Varnes listened, his stomach churning with a nausea that threatened to buckle his knees as Amara described the burial that served as the true beginning of the end. Hester had not wept or screamed, displaying a stoicism that terrified the other slaves more than any display of grief. She had washed her daughter's body in the river, wrapped her in a clean sheet, and carried her to the old, forgotten ground at the edge of the property where the ancestors lay. It was there, Amara testified, that Hester had performed the ritual that would call down the judgment of the earth. She had dug the grave with her bare hands, refusing all offers of help, and as she covered her child, she whispered words in a language that Amara did not recognize, a tongue that sounded like the wind through the cane and the water rushing over stones. The effect of Hester's prayer was immediate and palpable, altering the very atmosphere of the plantation within hours. That very night, the dogs had begun to howl, a mournful, desperate sound that would not cease, and the horses in the stable had kicked their stalls apart. In a frenzy of panic, Routh had retired to his study, but Amara reported hearing him shouting at empty corners of the room, carrying on heated arguments with invisible accusers. The temperature in the main house had dropped significantly, causing the windows to frost over, despite the sweltering heat of the Louisiana autumn. The master's grip on reality began to slip, replaced by a gnawing paranoia that the walls themselves were closing in on him. Amara described finding him the next morning, huddled beneath his desk, his eyes wide and darting, muttering about the red mud that he claimed was seeping up through the floorboards. The haunting intensified over the subsequent nights, driving the plantation toward its inevitable climax. Ruth refused to leave the house, convinced that something in the yard was waiting for him. Yet he found no sanctuary within the walls. Servants reported seeing the reflection of a small girl in the polished silverware, and hearing the sound of a child's laughter echoing from the sealed-up attic. Amara recounted how the master had taken to burning sage and salt in the fireplaces, a desperate attempt to purify the space that only served to choke the inhabitants with acrid smoke. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, his mind fractured by the relentless pressure of the unseen presence. He had tried to write a letter to a priest in Donaldsonville, but his hand had been seized by a tremor so violent that the ink had splattered across the page, rendering the plea illegible. On the final night, the fourth night of the torment, the plantation had descended into a chaos that forced the hand of fate. Amara described being woken by a sound like a landslide, a deep rumbling that shook the foundations of the quarters. She had rushed outside to see the master fleeing across the lawn, stripped of his dignity and his reason, running not toward the road, but toward the smokehouse. He moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if he were being pulled by an invisible tether. The doors of the smokehouse stood open, glowing with a faint, internal luminescence that illuminated the terror on his face. He had screamed once, a sound that Amara said would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. A sound of pure recognition that his time of judgment had arrived. Amara's testimony concluded with the final, terrible image of the master crossing the threshold into the brick chamber. The doors had slammed shut behind him, with a finality that echoed like a gunshot across the empty grounds, and a brilliant light had flared from the cracks in the masonry, blinding anyone who dared to look. The heat that radiated from the structure was intense enough to wither the grass in the yard, yet the building itself did not burn. When the light faded and the morning came, the silence had returned, but it was a different kind of silence, one of peace rather than oppression. The master was gone, his clothes left behind in the bedroom, and the shadow on the floor was the only testament to the price he had paid. Varnes closed his notebook, his hand trembling, as he looked at the woman who had borne witness to such impossible justice. Amara stood up from the table, her testimony complete, and walked toward the back door, pausing only to deliver a final warning. She told the constable that the earth at Silverbend was no longer for sale, nor was it for the taking, and that any man who tried to work this land would find the ground as unforgiving as the judgment it had delivered. She then vanished into the pre-dawn mist, leaving Varnes alone in the kitchen with the weight of a story that would challenge the very foundations of the legal system he served. The investigation was far from over. In truth, the struggle to define the truth of Silverbend had only just begun. The Assumption Parish Courthouse in Napoleonville became the unlikely stage for a collision between the rational world and the inexplicable events at Silverbend. On the morning of October the 25th, 1844, the grand jury convened to hear the preliminary findings regarding the disappearance of Elias Ruth. The room was packed with curious citizens, local planters, and merchants, all eager to hear how the law would handle a situation that defied every statute in the books. Judge Thaddeus Morrow, a man known for his strict adherence to the letter of the law, presided with a stern demeanor, his gavel striking the bench with a sound that silenced the murmuring crowd. Constable Varnes sat at the witness table, the physical evidence recovered from the smokehouse secured in a leather satchel at his feet, knowing that the testimony he was about to give would either cement his reputation or ruin it entirely. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, a tangible tension that seemed to vibrate off the whitewashed walls of the rural courtroom. Varnes took the stand first, his voice steady despite the turmoil roiling within him, and presented a chronological account of his arrival at the plantation. He detailed the discovery of the abandoned slave quarters, the undisturbed mansion, and the chilling state of the master bedroom, where Ruth's clothing lay arranged in a ritualistic fashion. The clerk recorded every word, the scratching of his pen the only sound accompanying the constable's narrative. Varnes was careful to omit the more subjective elements of his experience, focusing instead on the physical clues that could be entered into the official record. He described the ring found in the ash and the burnt shadow on the brick floor, presenting them as material evidence of a death, though he stopped short of declaring it a homicide. The jury listened with rapt attention, their faces a mix of skepticism and growing unease as the narrative painted a picture of a world turned upside down. The tension in the room escalated sharply when Dr. Alastair Finch, the parish coroner, took the stand to present his medical findings. Finch was a man of science, trained in Philadelphia, and his discomfort with the evidence was palpable as he unfolded his report. He testified that the residue found in the smokehouse was indeed human ash, confirming the death of an adult male. But he could not offer a scientific explanation for the manner of cremation. He noted that the bricks beneath the remains showed no signs of the prolonged heat required to reduce a body to such a state, creating a paradox that defied the laws of thermodynamics. The gold ring, he confirmed, bore the Ruth family crest and was identified by the family solicitor as the personal property of the missing planter. Finch's admission that the death could not be categorized as natural, accidental, or conventionally homicidal sent a ripple of confusion through the proceedings. The confusion turned to shock when the court called a surprise witness, a well-dressed man named Julian Harrow from New Orleans. Harrow identified himself as the senior partner of Harrow and Sons, a legal firm that had handled the Ruth family's affairs for 3 generations. He produced a document dated October 14th, 1844, just days before the disappearance, which he claimed had been delivered to his office by Elias Ruth himself. The judge ordered the document to be read aloud, and the clerk's voice trembled as he deciphered the heavy script. It was a deed of manumission, a legal instrument granting immediate and unconditional freedom to every enslaved person on the Silver Bend estate. The revelation struck the courtroom like a thunderclap, challenging every assumption about the master's intentions and the nature of his final days. Harrow continued his testimony, providing a context for the sudden act of benevolence that seemed to contradict Routh's history of brutality. He stated that the planter had arrived at his office in a state of extreme agitation, ranting about debts that could not be paid in currency. Routh had insisted that the document be executed immediately, ignoring Harrow's advice regarding the financial ruin such an act would bring upon the estate. The lawyer recalled that Ruth had spoken of a reckoning that was approaching, a force that was coming to collect on the suffering he had caused. The courtroom, filled with slaveholders who viewed their property rights as sacred, listened in stunned silence as the testimony painted a picture of a man terrified by forces beyond his comprehension. This legal maneuver, seemingly an act of moral awakening, was framed by the lawyer as a desperate bargain with fate. The proceedings took a darker turn with the testimony of Reverend Silas Galt, an itinerant preacher who had served the spiritual needs of the river parishes for decades. The Reverend testified that he had been summoned to Silver Bend on the night of October 16th by a frantic messenger. He described finding Ruth in the library, not drinking or raving, but cowering behind a barricade of furniture, his eyes darting toward the windows as if expecting an invader. Galt recounted that the planter had begged for absolution, confessing to crimes that the Reverend refused to repeat in polite company, but which he noted in his private journal for the historical record. The spiritual advisor's testimony shifted the narrative from a legal mystery to a metaphysical crisis, suggesting that the events at Silver Bend were the result of a moral collapse rather than a criminal conspiracy. Reverend Galt's most damning evidence was a handwritten confession that Ruth had pressed into his hands during the final hours of the night. The judge ordered the document entered into evidence, though its contents were summarized rather than read aloud to spare the sensibilities of the ladies present. The summary revealed that Ruth admitted to the murder of the child Hope, acknowledging that her death had been a deliberate act of terror intended to break the spirit of her mother, Hester. He confessed that he had been haunted by the sound of the child's voice and the sight of her shadow since the night of the burial, torments that no amount of prayer or whiskey could silence. The confession provided the motive for the manumission, framing it not as a gesture of kindness, but as a frantic attempt to appease a judgment that had already been rendered. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavy as the implications of the testimony settled over the assembly. The narrative that emerged was one of a man tried and convicted by a court that existed outside of human jurisdiction. The witnesses had provided a timeline that led inevitably to the smokehouse, filling the gaps left by the lack of a body with a terrifying certainty. Varnes watched the faces of the jurors, seeing the struggle between their world-view, which relied on the stability of property and hierarchy, and the evidence, which suggested that the oppressed possessed a power that the masters could not control. The clerk sweated profusely over his transcription, his hand cramping as he tried to capture the surreal nature of the proceedings. The trial was no longer about finding a killer. It was about containing a story that threatened to unravel the social fabric of the entire region. Judge Morrow called for a brief recess to review the evidence, but the break did little to dissipate the tension that had gripped the courthouse. Outside on the lawn, groups of men huddled in whispered conversations, casting nervous glances toward the river road that led to Silverbend. The realization that an enslaved woman's prayer might have brought down a planter of Ruth's stature was a dangerous thought, one that challenged the fundamental premise of the Southern way of life. Varnes stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a gnarled oak tree, his mind replaying the testimonies he had heard. The legal system was designed to process crimes of passion and greed, but it had no framework for a crime of spiritual retribution. He knew that the verdict the judge was about to deliver would be an attempt to close a door that could never truly be shut again. When the court reconvened, Judge Morrow delivered his ruling with a gravity that silenced the room. He declared that while the evidence proved the death of Elias Ruth, the specific cause remained undetermined and inscrutable to human reason. He formally recognized the deed of manumission as a valid legal instrument, thereby freeing the former slaves of Silverbend, though he did so with a reluctance that was evident in his tight-lipped delivery. The judge ordered the estate to be settled, and the property liquidated to satisfy creditors, effectively erasing the physical legacy of the Ruth family in Assumption Parish. It was a verdict designed to restore order, a bureaucratic closing of a file that nature had already settled, but the hollowness of the proclamation rang clear in the air. The law had spoken, but its voice trembled. As the courtroom emptied and the crowd dispersed into the humid afternoon, Varnes remained in his seat, staring at the empty witness stand. The legal proceedings had provided a framework for the story, but they had failed to capture the true magnitude of what had occurred. The judge's gavel might have dismissed the case, but the shadow in the smokehouse and the name of Hester lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. The constable gathered his papers, his thoughts already drifting toward the future of the abandoned land, and the woman who had become a legend in her own time. He realized that the trial had been merely the first skirmish in a much longer conflict, a struggle between the desire to forget and the necessity of remembering. The system had attempted to rationalize the irrational, but the earth itself was waiting to testify. The legal dissolution of the Ruth estate proceeded with a bureaucratic coldness that stood in stark contrast to the fiery passions that had consumed its owner. By the first week of November, 1844, the public auction of Silverbend's movable assets was announced in the Assumption Pioneer, inviting buyers from as far as New Orleans to bid on the trappings of a doomed dynasty. Constable Varnes oversaw the inventory with a heavy heart, watching as the personal effects of a tyrant were tallied and priced like common livestock. The atmosphere on the plantation during these preparations was oppressive. The auctioneers complained of headaches and nosebleeds, and several prospective buyers abandoned their inspections early, claiming the air in the main house tasted of copper and ash. Despite the attractive prices, a pall of hesitation hung over the proceedings, as if the auctioneer's gavel might summon the same judgment that had befallen the master. The sale of the land itself proved to be an insurmountable challenge for the creditors hoping to recoup their losses. The vast acreage of Silverbend, theoretically worth a small fortune in cane production, sat unsold as rumors of the hungry earth spread through the river parishes. Varnes noted in his journal that 3 potential buyers had expressed interest, only to withdraw their offers after spending a single night on the property. They spoke of a low, rhythmic thumping sound that seemed to emanate from the soil itself, a heartbeat that grew louder as one approached the slave cemetery. The land had been effectively devalued, not by market forces, but by a supernatural stigma that no surveyor could map and no lawyer could litigate. The economic machinery of the South ground to a halt at the borders of Silverbend, respecting a higher authority than profit. Meanwhile, a different kind of migration began to take shape in the shadow of the abandoned estate. Under the protection of the controversial deed of manumission, the former slaves of Silverbend began to return, not as laborers, but as guardians. Led by Amara, they established a small encampment near the old cemetery, distinct from the grand house they had once served. They carried with them not belongings, but a sense of purpose that Varn found both inspiring and unsettling. They were not reclaiming the land for agriculture, but for memory, tending to the unmarked graves with a reverence that stood in defiance of the commercial destiny the court had planned for the property. This quiet reoccupation was a political act, a statement that the earth belonged to those who had suffered for it. The return of the former slaves drew the attention of the surrounding planter class, who viewed the autonomous community as a dangerous precedent. Letters preserved in the parish archives reveal a growing panic among the neighbors, who feared that the Silverbend fever might spread to their own human property. A secret meeting was held at a nearby hunting lodge, where a coalition of influential landowners agreed that the site of the haunting needed to be sanitized. They viewed the burnt shadow and the consecrated graves as physical manifestations of a slave revolt, one that needed to be erased before it could inspire imitation. Varnes, whose position placed him on the fringes of this society, caught wind of the conspiracy through whispered conversations at the general store. realizing that a new violence was about to descend upon Silverbend. The planter coalition did not resort to legal channels, recognizing that the courts had already failed them by validating the manumission. Instead, they hired a group of itinerant laborers and agitators, men known for their discretion and their brutality, with the specific task of destroying the cemetery. Their objective was to plow under the graves, scatter the remains, and burn the vegetation that had grown so wildly around the site. By erasing the physical evidence of Hester and Hope, they hoped to break the spiritual hold the story had on the region. The logic was cruel, but simple. If there were no graves to visit, there could be no pilgrimage. And without a pilgrimage, the legend would starve and die. Varnes confronted the ringleader of the mob, a man named Silas Gant, on the muddy road leading out of Napoleonville. The encounter, later detailed in Varnes's private memoirs, was tense and brief. Gant, a man with a reputation for violence that rivaled the late Ruth's, spat on the ground and told the constable that the law had no jurisdiction over cleaning up a mess. He made it clear that Varnes's badge would not protect him if he chose to stand in the way of progress. The constable realized that his authority had evaporated the moment the court verdict failed to declare a clear winner. The rules of civilization were being suspended in favor of the old laws of power and suppression. He was faced with a choice: uphold a fragile peace or witness a massacre. Returning to Silverbend to warn Amara, Varnes found the encampment bustling with a quiet activity that was far more organized than he had anticipated. They were not fortifying the camp with physical weapons, but were engaged in a different kind of preparation. Amara directed the placement of candles and the drawing of patterns in the dirt, actions that seemed to be part of a ceremony rather than a defense strategy. When Varnes relayed the news of the approaching mob, Amara did not flinch. She told him that the men coming to destroy the graves were not bringing a new threat, but rather offering themselves as the final payment on an old debt. Her calmness in the face of imminent violence terrified him more than the mob had. The night before the anticipated attack, a heavy fog rolled in from the bayou, shrouding the plantation in a blanket of white that muffled all sound. Varnes chose to stay, not as a lawman, but as a witness, taking up a hidden position in the tree line overlooking the cemetery. He wrote in his notebook that the silence was not empty, but full, vibrating with a potential energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. The former slaves had gathered in a circle around Hester's grave, their voices raised in a low, harmonic chant that seemed to weave into the mist. It was a vigil, a summoning of the very forces that had consumed Routh, and it transformed the clearing into a cathedral of the oppressed. As midnight approached, the chanting stopped abruptly, and the woods fell into a silence so deep it hurt the ears. Varnes strained his eyes against the fog, waiting for the torches of the mob, but the darkness remained impenetrable. Then he felt it. A tremor in the earth, faint at first, like the distant passing of a train, but growing steadily stronger. It was not the vibration of horses' hooves, but something deeper, a shifting of the subterranean strata itself. The air grew cold, freezing the moisture on the leaves, and the fog began to swirl with a violence that defied the wind. The boundary between the living and the dead was thinning, and the land was preparing to receive visitors. The sound of hoofbeats finally broke the silence, crude and jarring against the organic stillness of the plantation. Torches flickered in the distance as Gant and his riders thundered down the main avenue, a wave of fire and fury aimed at the heart of the cemetery. Vance watched them come, a tide of hatred seeking to extinguish the memory of Hester. Yet, as they crossed the invisible threshold of the estate, the horses began to scream. It was a terrible, high-pitched sound of terror, and the charge faltered as the animals refused to advance, rearing and throwing their riders into the mud. The attack had begun, but the defenders were not the ones who would be fighting for their lives. The earth was awake, and it was hungry. The chaos in the avenue was immediate and absolute, a violent disruption of the natural order that left the aggressors humiliated before they could even raise a weapon. Horses, typically obedient to the spur and the whip, reared high into the air, their eyes rolling wildly as they encountered an invisible barrier of pure terror. Several of the beasts collapsed onto their sides, throwing their riders into the sucking mud of the road, while others turned and bolted back toward the safety of the main road, trampling the underbrush in their panic. Vance watched from the tree line, his breath catching in his throat, as the torches held by the riders sputtered and died simultaneously, plunging the avenue into a darkness broken only by the sickly glow of the fog. The mob's numerical superiority had been rendered useless in seconds, not by gunfire or walls, but by a primal fear that seized the animals' hearts. Silas Gant, the ringleader, struggled to his feet in the mire, his face twisted in a snarl of disbelief and rage. He shouted for his men to form a line, his voice cracking as he tried to assert command over a situation that had spiraled into absurdity. He drew a pistol, aiming it vaguely toward the cemetery, but the weapon malfunctioned with a dull click, the percussion cap failing to ignite the powder. This mechanical failure, replicated across the weapons of the men who managed to stand, was documented later by Vance as a systematic suppression of firepower, as if the very air was too thick for combustion. The mob was stripped of their technical advantage, reduced to a group of frightened men standing in the cold mud, holding useless iron clubs against an enemy they could not see. From the center of the cemetery, the chanting rose again, led by Amara and the gathered descendants, but the sound had changed. It was no longer a song of mourning, but a deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of the bones. The fog around the cemetery began to swirl rapidly, defying the stillness of the night air, coalescing into pillars of white mist that stood taller than the cane. Vance rubbed his eyes, unsure if the exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but the shapes solidified, taking on the translucent contours of human forms. They were not menacing in their posture, but they radiated a density that felt heavier than the living bodies watching from the trees. The earth was not merely remembering, it was manifesting. The ground beneath the riders began to undulate, a sickening motion that mimicked the swell of the ocean, causing the men to stumble and lose their footing. This was not the violence of an earthquake, but a deliberate rejection of the intruder's weight. Small geysers of mud and water erupted from the tire tracks left by the wagon wheels, spraying the men with cold black slime that smelled of sulfur and rot. The riders retreated in a disorganized scramble, their boots slipping on the suddenly fluid earth, their curses replaced by prayers and screams of panic. The land itself had become a hostile entity, actively pushing them back toward the gate they had so arrogantly breached. A sharp, piercing cold descended upon the avenue, freezing the mud instantly into jagged ridges that tore at the men's boots and trousers. Varn saw his own breath plume in the air, a physical impossibility for a Louisiana autumn, confirming that the laws of thermodynamics had been suspended. The temperature drop was accompanied by a sound that froze the blood in his veins, the laughter of a child. It was a bright, clear sound, utterly out of place amidst the terror and the grime, echoing from the direction of the old sugar mill. It was a sound that signified not joy, but a terrifying inversion of innocence, a signal that the dead child Hope was present and aware of the invaders. Gant, seemingly driven mad by the combination of the cold, the failure of his weapons, and the spectral laughter, made a final desperate charge toward the cemetery gate. He wielded a heavy iron lantern, swinging it like a club, screaming curses that were swallowed by the mist. He managed to cross the boundary of the graveyard, his foot stepping onto the consecrated soil, but he got no further. The earth opened beneath him, not into a chasm, but into a soft, grasping mire that sucked his leg down to the knee with a wet, slurping sound. He thrashed and screamed, his bravado shattered as the ground held him fast, a prisoner of the very soil he had sought to violate. The translucent figures in the mist moved forward, surrounding the trapped ringleader in a silent circle of judgment. Varners could see their faces now, or rather, the impression of faces, some bearing the scars of whips, others the hollow cheeks of starvation, all etched with the pain of their earthly lives. They did not speak, but their presence was a louder accusation than any testimony could provide. Gant's screams turned to whimpers as he looked up at the spirits of the people he and his kind had oppressed, realizing that no sheriff or judge could save him from this court. The spectral assembly stood as a silent jury, their stillness more terrifying than any physical assault. Hester's form appeared at the forefront of the assembly, distinguishable by the red cloth wrapped around her head and the undeniable authority of her posture. She did not look at Gant with anger, but with a cold, dispassionate pity that cut deeper than hatred. She raised a hand, and the ground released its grip on the man's leg, ejecting him from the soil with a force that sent him sprawling backward onto the avenue. The message was clear. The dead did not require blood, only the departure of the living. They were not murderers, but guardians, and their power was absolute within the borders of their domain. Scrambling to his feet, Gant did not look back, nor did he attempt to rally his men. He ran with the frantic energy of absolute terror, stumbling through the fog toward the main road, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness. The other riders, seeing their leader broken and repelled, followed suit, abandoning their torches and their horses in a desperate bid to escape the haunted ground. The retreat was a rout, a chaotic stampede of terrified men, fleeing from a vengeance they could not comprehend. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the heavy breathing of the horses that had been left behind, now calm and grazing peacefully near the gate. Varn stepped out from his hiding spot, his legs trembling as he walked toward the cemetery, his lantern held high to illuminate the scene. The mist was already dissipating, sinking back into the earth as quickly as it had risen, and the temperature was beginning to climb, restoring the natural humid warmth of the night. The spirits had vanished, leaving behind a trampled avenue, and the broken will of the mob, but the graves remained untouched and serene. Amara and the other survivors stood by the memorial, their faces calm in the flickering light of the candles, their duty done for the night. They looked at the constable not with triumph, but with a solemn understanding that the peace had been purchased with a power that the living could never fully possess. The constable approached the spot where Gant had been trapped, shining his light onto the mud. There, embedded in the frozen earth, was a perfect handprint, burned into the soil as if by intense heat, marking the spot where the earth had refused to let the transgressor pass. Vance knelt beside it, realizing that this was the second miracle of Silverbend, a physical testament that would serve as a warning to any future challengers. The plantation had passed from the jurisdiction of the parish into the custody of the memory, and no legal deed or mob violence could ever reclaim it. As the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the trees, Vance turned his back on the cemetery, ready to write the final chapter of the official report that would try, and fail, to capture the truth of what had transpired. The immediate aftermath of the failed assault brought a profound silence to Assumption Parish, a quietude that felt less like peace and more like the held breath of a terrified region. Officially, the court records for November 1844 make no mention of a riot or a spectral intervention. The incident was logged merely as a dispersal of trespassers on the Ruth estate, a bureaucratic erasure that fooled no one. Silas Gant and his disgraced riders refused to speak of their ordeal, their silence bought by a terror that outweighed their desire for revenge or reputation. They had ridden out as masters of their domain, and returned as broken men, fleeing the parish entirely within the week, leaving behind unpaid bills and whispered rumors of a power that could stop a horse with a thought. The silence of the conspirators served as the strongest possible confirmation of the supernatural reckoning. For Constable Vance, the following weeks were a period of intense professional and personal reckoning. He found himself unable to perform his duties with the necessary detachment, his mind constantly drifting back to the handprint burned into the mud and the translucent faces of the dead. The legal system he represented felt like a thin veneer painted over a roiling ocean of ancient forces, and he could no longer enforce the laws of men when the laws of the earth held greater authority. He began to draft a series of lengthy reports detailing the unusual geological and atmospheric phenomena observed at Silverbend, intending to submit them to the state authorities in Baton Rouge, though he knew that such documents would likely be dismissed as the ravings of a man losing his grip on reality. The weight of the truth was becoming a burden he could hardly carry alone. The turning point for Vance came on a rainy afternoon in early December, when a letter arrived from the State Attorney General's office questioning the delays in the final settlement of the Routh estate. The tone of the missive was dismissive, treating the haunting as a local superstition that was hindering commerce, and it demanded a swift resolution to clear the title of the land. Vance read the words with a growing sense of disgust, realizing that the state was intent on forcing the land back into productivity, regardless of the moral cost. He saw that the courts would never acknowledge the sanctity of the cemetery or the justice that had been served. They would only see lost revenue and a challenge to the social order. This demand for conformity was the final straw, severing his last tie to the institution he had served for decades. On December 15th, 1844, Silas Varnes submitted his resignation to the parish sheriff, ending a career that had spanned nearly 2 decades. The letter of resignation was brief and formal, citing health concerns and a desire to pursue private interests in New Orleans. But the subtext was clear to those who knew him best. He could no longer wear a badge that obligated him to protect the interests of men like Routh and Gant, nor could he pretend that the laws he enforced were anything more than tools of oppression. The resignation was a liberation, shedding the skin of a servant of the state to become a witness to a higher truth. He packed his belongings in silence, leaving the office he had occupied for so long without a backward glance. Before departing for the city, Varnes made one final pilgrimage to Silver Bend, driven by a need to see the land without the lens of an investigator or a lawman. He found the plantation fundamentally changed, not in its physical structure, which was slowly crumbling into the bayou, but in its atmosphere. The air was no longer heavy with dread, but calm and watchful, a silence that felt like a benediction. The main house stood empty, its windows dark, surrendering to the encroaching vines and moss that were slowly reclaiming the timber. The fields of cane had grown wild, a chaotic tangle of green that stood in defiance of the straight rows of agriculture, creating a natural barrier against the return of commerce. The land had healed itself by rejecting the master's purpose. Varnes made his way to the cemetery, where he found Amara tending to the graves with a quiet devotion that bordered on the ritualistic. She had placed fresh wildflowers on the mound where hope lay, and a new, sturdy wooden marker had been erected at the head of the plot. The names of the dead were being reclaimed, one by one, from the anonymity of the ledger. Amara greeted the former constable with a nod, acknowledging the role he had played in ensuring their safety, but she spoke little. There was no need for words between them. They were both survivors of a history that was rapidly passing into legend. Her presence there confirmed that the community was not rebuilding the past, but sanctifying the present. As Varnes stood by the graveside, he noticed a small, green sapling pushing up through the soil near Hester's final resting place, a species he did not recognize, with leaves of a deep, vibrant green. It was growing with an unnatural vigor, seemingly fed by the rich, dark earth that held so many secrets. Amara told him that it had appeared after the night of the attack, a sign that the ground was no longer cursed, but consecrated. The paradox of the plantation, that it was a place of death that now teemed with a strange new life, struck Varnes with full force. The violence had purified the soil, transforming a site of suffering into a monument of resistance that nature itself was eager to honor. The former constable returned to his horse, but before mounting, he looked back at the main house one last time. He saw that the doors were not just closed, but seemingly fused shut by the humidity and the growth of the swamp, as if the structure were sealing itself off from the outside world. He realized that Silver Bend would never be a plantation again. It had become something else entirely, a testament written in mud and memory. The legal deeds and the surveying chains would never again hold dominion over this acreage. The land had claimed its sovereignty, and no court in the land could overturn that verdict. Varnes rode away from the estate, turning his horse toward the river road that led to New Orleans, carrying with him the heavy leather satchel containing his notes and the testimonies he had gathered. He felt a profound sense of failure regarding his professional duty, but a soaring sense of success in his moral one. He had failed to solve a crime because there had been no crime to solve, only a judgment to witness. The road ahead was uncertain, but he knew that his work was far from finished. The story of Silverbend was too important to be buried in the parish archives, waiting for the dust to obscure the truth. The transition from lawman to chronicler began that very afternoon in a cramped room above a tavern in Donaldsonville, where Varnes inked a new pen and opened a fresh journal. He began to write, not a report for a judge, but a narrative for the future. He detailed the death of Hope, the torment of Ruth, and the rising of the spirits with a precision that sought to capture the emotional weight of the events. He wrote until his hand cramped, and the candle burned low, driven by the conviction that the ledger of history needed to be corrected. The silence of the official records would be filled by his voice. Thus, the quiet burial of the past gave way to the laborious birth of a legend. As Varnes disappeared into the anonymity of the city, he carried the seeds of a story that would eventually bloom into a reckoning for the entire South. The physical conflict at Silverbend had ended in the mud of the cemetery, but the ideological war for the memory of that ground was just beginning. The earth had kept its account, and now it fell to the living to ensure that the balance was never forgotten. The first chapter of the haunting was closed, but the book itself was far from finished. The calendar pages turned with a lethargic weight, marking the passage of 10 years since the night the earth rejected the mob. New Orleans had become a labyrinth of brick and noise for Silas Varnes, a city where the air smelled of coal smoke and commerce rather than the damp rot of the swamp. He had established a modest practice as a private inquiry agent, a profession that allowed him to operate on the fringes of the law he once served, investigating matters that the official police chose to ignore. His reputation was that of a man who understood the darker currents of the city, yet his mind remained anchored to the banks of Bayou La Fourche. The manuscript he had carried with him, a testament to the reckoning at Silverbend, lay dormant in a locked drawer, waiting for a moment that seemed perpetually out of reach. The catalyst for the narrative's resurrection arrived on a humid afternoon in June 1854, delivered by a courier who refused to step inside the office. The envelope was sealed with red wax, bearing no return address, only the faint scent of crushed wildflowers that triggered a memory Varnes could not suppress. Inside, the letter was brief, written in a precise, elegant hand that contrasted sharply with the grim memories it invoked. The message read simply, "The time for silence has passed. Come back to the river. The stones are ready to speak." It was signed only with a single initial R, a signature that Varnes intuitively linked to the legacy of the plantation. The summons was clear, pulling him back towards the ghosts he had spent a decade trying to bury. Varnes packed a single leather bag, discarding the trappings of his city life for the rougher attire of the river traveler. He chartered a steamboat heading north against the current, watching the sprawling city give way to the endless green curtain of the swamp. The journey up the Mississippi was a passage through a landscape that seemed increasingly unstable, both politically and geologically. talk among the passengers was dominated by the growing sectional crisis, the rumble of distant political thunder that threatened to tear the Union apart. But Varnes listened with a different perspective. He had seen the fragility of the social order firsthand, had watched it dissolve in the face of a higher power, and he knew that the coming storm had roots far deeper than legislation or politics. Disembarking at the landing nearest to Assumption Parish, Varnes found the countryside altered, scarred by a decade of struggle and decline. Plantations that had once been the pride of the sugared aristocracy now showed signs of decay, with paint peeling from mansions and fields lying fallow. The locals he encountered spoke in hushed tones of bad ground and wandering spirits, a folklore that had spread like a blight since the events at Silverbend. The legend had seeped into the soil of the region, tainting the confidence of the planters and emboldening the oppressed. It was no longer just a story. It was a contagion of memory that threatened the economic foundation of the South. Approaching the gates of Silverbend, Varnes was struck by the transformation of the estate. The Grand Oak Alley was now a tunnel of untamed vegetation, the trees interlocking overhead to form a cathedral of shadow. The main house, once a symbol of imperious dominance, had collapsed in on itself, the roof caved in, and the white columns cracked and leaning like broken teeth. Nature had not been gentle in its reclamation. It had been ruthless, tearing down the edifice of human pride with a relentless vegetal strength. The sight filled Varnes with a grim satisfaction, a confirmation that the master's dominion was truly dead. He made his way towards the rear of the estate, guided by the sound of a voice reading aloud in the stillness. In the clearing that had once been the slave cemetery, a profound change had taken place. The rough wooden markers were gone, replaced by carefully hewn stone slabs, each bearing a name and a date. It was a library of the lost, a reconstruction of the history that the ledgers had tried to erase. In the center of this sacred grove, a young woman sat on a bench beneath a massive oak tree, reading from a ledger that Varnes recognized as one of Ruth's own account books. She looked up as he approached, her eyes carrying the same haunting intensity he remembered from the cane fields. The woman introduced herself as Ruth, the niece of Hester, and the keeper of the flame that had burned steadily in the darkness of the last decade. She explained that she had returned to Silverbend years ago, drawn by the stories whispered among the freed people of the region, to fulfill a promise made to the memory of her aunt. She had dedicated her life to recovering the names of the dead, cross-referencing the cold financial data of the plantation records with the oral histories of the survivors. Her work was an act of resurrection, breathing life back into the identities that the system had sought to obliterate. Ruth possessed a quiet, steely determination that reminded Varnes of the spectral figure he had seen in the mist. Ruth led Varnes to the base of the great oak tree, which stood as a sentinel over the heart of the cemetery. The oak was massive, far larger than a decade of growth should allow, its roots visibly threading through the red earth like the veins of the land. Tucked into a hollow of the trunk was a cavity lined with petitions and scraps of paper, offerings left by the pilgrims who had come to this place seeking justice. She told him that Silverbend had become a sanctuary for those who suffered, a place where the oppressed could come to lay down their burdens and speak the names of the lost. The pilgrimage had transformed the site from a crime scene into a holy ground, a counter-narrative to the brutality of the surrounding plantations. She revealed the true purpose of her summons, producing a bundle of documents that she had spent years compiling. It was a comprehensive dossier, combining Varnes's eyewitness accounts with the testimonies she had gathered, the recovered names from the graves, and the financial records of the Ruth estate. Ruth argued that the story of Silverbend was not merely a local legend, but a weapon that needed to be wielded in the widening conflict over the soul of the nation. She urged Varnes to publish his manuscript, to merge it with her research, and to present the truth to a world that was finally ready to hear it. The silence that had protected the estate was now the very thing that needed to be broken. Varnes spent the remainder of the day walking the perimeter of the property, wrestling with the magnitude of the decision placed before him. To publish the account would be to invite danger, to challenge the powerful interests that thrived on the suppression of such truths. Yet, as he looked at the scar on the landscape where the smokehouse had once stood, now overgrown with impenetrable vines, he knew that the time for fear had passed. The earth had done its part, swallowing the tyrant and repelling the mob. Now it was the turn of the living to fulfill their obligation. The debt was not yet paid, for while the physical enemy had been defeated, the spiritual battle for memory remained undecided. As the sun set over the bayou, casting long shadows across the rows of stone, Varnes returned to Ruth and accepted the responsibility she offered. They worked through the night by the light of oil lamps, collating the evidence and refining the narrative into a structure that would withstand the scrutiny of history. The compilation of the Silverbend account was a solemn act of defiance, a declaration that the dead would not be forgotten. Varnes wrote the final line of the introduction with a hand that no longer trembled, sealing a pact with the past that would ripple into the future. The manuscript was no longer just a record of a haunting. It was a declaration of war against the erasure of the truth. The return journey to New Orleans marked the beginning of a frenetic period of compilation and revision for the former constable. Varnes secluded himself in his rented rooms on Rue Royale, surrounded by the stacks of documentation Ruth had entrusted to him, working with a fervor that alarmed his few remaining associates. The manuscript, tentatively titled The Silverbend Account, a Record of Judgment, evolved from a simple memoir into a complex legal and moral brief, citing the specific dates, financial records, and testimonies that corroborated the supernatural events. He cross-referenced the plantation's output logs with the dates of the haunting, proving a statistical anomaly in the harvest that coincided exactly with the death of the child Hope. The work was exhausting, demanding a precision that challenged his recollection of the chaotic nights in the bayou. Ruth joined him in the city during the sweltering month of August, bringing with her the final oral histories recorded from the surviving descendants. Her presence provided a necessary counterweight to Varnes's rigorous, lawman-like prose, injecting a somber humanity into the narrative. Together, they edited the chapters, ensuring that the voice of Hester was not lost amidst the dry details of the inquest and the inventory. Ruth insisted that the publication include the full list of the names recovered from the cemetery, transforming the book from a ghost story into a monument of genealogy. This collaboration forged a bond between the former lawman and the young historian, united by a shared mission to force the city to confront the sins of the countryside. Securing a publisher proved to be a battle nearly as arduous as the defense of the cemetery itself. The mainstream printing houses of New Orleans rejected the manuscript outright, fearing the wrath of the powerful sugar interests and the potential for social unrest. It was only through an abolitionist sympathizer in Boston that a willing press was found, a small outfit known for its defiance of Southern censorship. The contract was signed in secret, with provisions for the text to be printed in the North and smuggled back into Louisiana if necessary. The logistics of this clandestine publication added a layer of danger to the process, as Varnes knew that interception by the local authorities could result in the destruction of the work and his imprisonment. The book finally went to print in February 1855, emerging into a national atmosphere already charged with the static of impending conflict. The first print run was modest, consisting of only 500 copies, but the distribution was strategic, targeting libraries in the North and intellectual circles in Europe. Varnes held the finished volume in his hands, the weight of the paper a physical manifestation of the burden he had carried for a decade. The title page bore no author's name, only the attribution. By a witness to the truth, a choice designed to lend the text an air of anonymous authority. The cover was plain black cloth, unassuming yet dignified, holding within its binding a story that could shatter the foundations of an empire built on labor and blood. The reaction from the Southern establishment was swift and vitriolic, confirming every fear the publishers had harbored. Newspapers from New Orleans to Charleston denounced the work as a fabrication, a piece of abolitionist propaganda designed to incite servile insurrection. Critics mocked the shadow in the smokehouse as a hallucination born of swamp fever, while politicians demanded the arrest of the anonymous author. Varnes read these denunciations in the safety of his office, noting that the louder the denials became, the more attention the book garnered. The attempt to suppress the narrative only served to amplify its reach, driving curious readers to seek out the forbidden text with renewed vigor. Contrary to the expectations of the critics, the book did not fade into obscurity, but rather ignited a firestorm of debate in the halls of power. In Congress, a senator from Massachusetts cited the Silver Bend account during a heated debate on the expansion of slavery, reading aloud the names of the dead entered into the record of the proceedings. The act of speaking those names in the Capitol transformed them from local victims into national martyrs, irrevocably changing the scope of the story. Varnes watched from a distance as the specific, intimate tragedy of Hester and Hope became a rallying cry for a movement that was sweeping the nation. The story had escaped the boundaries of Assumption Parish and was now marching toward history. Ruth received word that the cemetery at Silver Bend had become a site of reverence for those who had read the book. Pilgrims, both freedmen and sympathetic whites, were traveling to the ruins to pay their respects, leaving offerings at the base of the great oak tree. The physical site had merged with the literary text, creating a feedback loop of memory that the land itself seemed to endorse. Reports filtered back that the strange, white flowers continued to bloom on Hester's grave regardless of the season, a botanical anomaly that defied explanation and served as a living testament to the book's claims. The earth was confirming the narrative, providing physical evidence that the skeptics could not easily dismiss. Varnes found himself the recipient of hundreds of letters, many of them anonymous, thanking him for breaking the silence. Some were from other investigators who had encountered similar hungry ground on other plantations, sharing their own fragments of suppressed history. These communications revealed a pattern of resistance that had long been hidden beneath the surface of the official records. Varnes began to file these letters alongside his original notes, creating a secondary archive that suggested Silverbend was merely one node in a vast, interconnected network of supernatural justice. The book had acted as a beacon, drawing other witnesses out of the shadows and into the light. The culmination of this literary crusade arrived in the spring of 1856, in the form of a letter that arrived with the Morning Post. The handwriting was elegant and archaic, bearing the distinct posture of a different era. The message was brief, thanking the witness for ensuring that the debt was recorded and that the names were spoken. It was signed simply, "A Friend of the Earth." There was no return address, but the scent of wildflowers that clung to the paper was unmistakable to Varnes, a sensory echo of the clearing in the cane. It was a benediction from beyond the veil, a confirmation that his labor had been accepted by the very forces he had chronicled. The impact of the Silverbend account rippled outward, contributing to the widening chasm that would eventually tear the nation apart. While it did not single-handedly start the war, it served as a critical fracture point in the moral argument for the South's peculiar institution. It provided a vocabulary for the invisible suffering of the land, framing the conflict not just as a political dispute, but as a spiritual reckoning. Varnes watched the country drift toward the abyss with a heavy heart, knowing that the warning issued from the bayou had gone unheeded by those in power. The book stood as a testament that the earth would eventually collect its due, with interest on a scale far grander than a single plantation. As the decade drew to a close, Varnes visited the cemetery one last time before the coming storm made travel impossible. He found Ruth tending the graves, her hair now streaked with the grey of age and worry, but her posture as unbowed as the oak tree above them. They stood together, in silence, watching the sun set over the fields, where the strange red cane still grew in wild, untamable thickets. They did not need to speak of the success of the book or the praise of the abolitionists. The true measure of their work lay in the peace of the ground beneath their feet. The debt was recorded, the names were remembered, and the silence of Silverbend had finally been transformed into a song of justice. The passage of a century and a half has done little to erode the physical boundaries of the legend, though the landscape of Assumption Parish has changed around it. Where the grand house of Elias Ruth once stood as a monument to power, there is now only a foundation of crumbling brick, swallowed by a thicket of Virginia creeper and muscadine vines. The state of Louisiana officially designated the site as a historical landmark in 1962, citing its architectural significance. But the bronze plaque installed at the gate tells a sanitized version of the story, speaking of hard times and economic shifts rather than the shadow in the smokehouse. Yet, the ground itself remains the primary curator of the site, refusing to yield to the developers who have attempted to turn the riverfront property into a resort or a subdivision. Each proposal has fallen through, derailed by sudden equipment failures or the mysterious illness of surveyors, reinforcing the local belief that the land holds a veto power over the future. The cemetery, hidden behind the curtain of untamed cane, has become a site of quiet pilgrimage, maintained not by the state, but by a trust established by the descendants of the original families. The headstones, weathered by the elements, have been supplemented by new markers that bear the names recovered from the ledgers, creating a tapestry of granite that corrects the silence of the past. Visitors often leave small offerings, coins, ribbons, and handwritten notes at the base of the great oak tree, which has grown to a monstrous girth, its branches canopying the entire clearing. Botanists who have studied the flora of the site have noted the presence of plant species that are non-native to the region, varieties that thrive in the red soil of the cemetery but wilt the moment they are transplanted beyond the gate. The scientific community has no explanation for this biological anomaly, classifying it as a localized mutation, while the faithful view it as a continuing miracle. The legacy of Silas Varnes lives on in the continued circulation of the Silverbend account, which has been translated into over a dozen languages and is currently in its 43rd printing. It is required reading in university courses on American folklore and the history of slavery, not merely as a ghost story, but as a primary source document regarding the psychology of resistance. Scholars continue to debate the veracity of the supernatural claims, analyzing the text for inconsistencies or metaphors, but the visceral power of the narrative remains undeniable. The book serves as a tangible link to the events of 1844, a testament written in ink that refuses to fade, ensuring that the names of Hester and Hope are spoken in classrooms and lecture halls across the world. The story that began in fear has matured into a cornerstone of cultural memory. On quiet evenings, when the wind dies down and the bayou settles into a reflective calm, locals claim that the atmosphere on the old Ruth estate changes. The air grows heavy and cool, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers that should not be blooming, and a sound like the hum of a distant congregation can be heard rising from the cane fields. It is a sound that is felt rather than heard, a vibration that resonates in the chest, suggesting that the spirits that once defended the ground have not entirely departed. They remain as sentinels, guarding the consecrated earth against the encroachment of a world that might wish to forget. The land is at peace, but it is a watchful peace, a constant reminder that the debt has been paid, but the account remains open. The story of Silverbend is no longer just a tale of a cruel master and a vengeful mother. It has transcended its origins to become a parable for the nation. It stands as proof that the earth is a living ledger, recording the suffering of the oppressed with a precision that human courts can never match. The red mud of Assumption Parish holds the memory of every lash and every tear, and the strange flowers that bloom on the graves are the receipts of a transaction that transformed a site of horror into a sanctuary. As the sun sets over the Mississippi, casting long shadows across the ruins, the message remains etched in the soil. Justice may be delayed by the laws of men, but it is never denied by the laws of nature. The ground remembers, and it will always collect what it is owed,